Good morning, everybody. Apologies for the late start. Assume everybody had a good night last night?
That's the late start.
I don't have an excuse, so I went to bed fairly earlier.
One is not needed.
Before security came. So, Brewmaster, I don't know if you want to join in the fishbowl. Fishbowl?
Huh?
Fishbowl? Do you want to come in? What's, who's that? Let's do it this way. Yeah, that's that one. Do we switch over?
.com.
Oops. Okay. We'll start with this one. So we just want to revisit basically what we discussed for Oneric, and we also want to verify we have the correct workloads, and that if anybody, like if there are any new benchmarking tools or new workloads that we want to test for the precise period once we have hardware. So let me start with this new. Let me throw this up here in the ether panel. So we have a wiki page where we've kind of outlined the tests, some of the tests that we've been running. There's also instructions on how we set it up and how we've run them. And then the next step is to get these automated into Jenkins and on the platform team's automated test suite once the either the Panda hardware is installed, so we have setup working, or if we get or once we get real hardware, it'll migrate over to that. So I think these preliminary items are all PTS. So the Phoronix test suite has a set of benchmarks for Apache, Java, OpenSSL, PGBench, basically all of the workloads that we've identified previously. And then we also have individual setups at the bottom, some kernel testing, VLAN, IPsec. The IPv6 stuff was on here. Is it still on here, Toby?
No, IPv6 was not tested.
Oh.
IPv6, we currently do not have a Linux test suite for. There is a really good test suite available, but it's only in FreeBSD or NetBSD, BSD, something BSD. It does not compile on Linux currently.
So that's a gap.
And I think there's a session later today or tomorrow that I'm going to bring that up.
Okay. Do we have any other gaps, or do we want to review this list for things that additional tests that we want to include that we're concerned for ARM server?
Did you want to pull up the two blueprints from Oneric that have all the work headers?
Yeah, can you send me those links? So in the meantime, I guess let's go ahead and just finish reviewing the page. So iSCSI root, Ceph, looks, RAID. Oh yeah, we did. We install.
Are these benchmark functional benchmark or performance?
So
they're more for stressing the system. We're not publishing any actual benchmark results because, well, for one, the benchmarking we're running for server benchmarking, we're running them on essentially a cell phone. So it'd be grossly unfair to the chipset manufacturer to publish benchmarks for that. And they've actually asked us not to publish benchmarks. So But we can use the benchmark utilities to stress test the software stack.
That means it's a functionality test.
Yeah, this last cycle was mainly a pipe cleaning to test the entire server stack on ARM, because we don't have any actual server hardware yet. Calzada is going to be really cool and give us some toys to play with soon, apparently. I hope. But until then, you know, the only thing we have available are Panda boards, Beagle boards, you know, things that really aren't server-centric systems. So
those weren't done on Panda board?
All that was done on Panda boards, yes.
So you don't publish any results because the numbers are...
Well, like I said, you know, publishing benchmark results, pass or fail is good enough to understand that, hey, the tests are running. And that was our key goal. But to give actual benchmark data, it'd be unfair for TI if we're publishing benchmarking data when they're not focusing on performance in the server market. So it's kind of unfair for them.
What are we going to compare the results next time we run them?
It really depends on the hardware vendor. If they want us to publish results, we can publish results, but we're not really going to be looking to do that.
Right, so the idea is just to make sure that the performance tests, so in a sense, these are functional tests to make sure that these benchmarks test the applications on ARM and that the applications work, obviously. The idea in the end is once we do get hardware, we're going to run the performance testing and get the numbers. And we also have, actually, from the Calzada demo, the announcement the other day, had specs that we can actually test against on real hardware if we'd like the x86. And we're probably going to do that in the next couple months, so we have numbers to compare against. So once we do have hardware, we'll run the exact same performance tests, verify that obviously that they function, obtain the numbers, and we can do comparisons at that point. But until that point, there's no sense in comparing a Panda
Out
to...
of curiosity, how do you intend to compare against the product that the clock rate is not going to reveal?
the clock rate was revealed. I think it was 1.1 to 1.4.
It's a pretty big range.
It is a big range, but I mean, we can get the lower end and get the higher end, and then we can always...
And we're not publishing benchmarks comparing with other hardware. Our benchmarking is going to be mainly for regression testing. That's it.
So you said you're going to run them on your hardware, or what do you use to run them?
Which?
The benchmarks?
Right now?
Yeah.
On
We
the
just said that we ran them on Panda.
Yeah, just to make sure that they run...
manual.
I'm sorry?
You run them manual.
Right now they're manual. Well, so for the Phoronix tests, they're semi-automated. And the idea is to get them into Jenkins and have those completely automated once the Panda boards are in the platform infrastructure to do that.
Those benchmarks, are they commercial or they are Ubuntu written by Ubuntu IP, or this is commercial benchmark?
These are all public and they're open source for the Phoronix test suite. So anybody can run those for the Phoronix ones. The other ones that were identified, I think Jobin had done most of the other ones. Functional testing are all the instructions. Again, it's all open source.
How does this list compare to what's being run on x86 in a canonical Ubuntu?
Right. So I think there was the test. Meetup social yesterday. I think one of the guys from PDS, or he might have been the PDS. Oh, hey. Yeah, so do you want to answer that question?
They can all run on x86, ARM, some of them are, in terms of what Canonical's doing internally, I think they're mostly using like the checkbox and more like the functional testing, not like performance testing like these. But some of their tests I think are running PDS, like from checkbox, I think it was checkbox or one of the other forks of it, they haven't really can run a Phoronix test suite test from inside there.
Yeah, these are slightly different. This is a larger set specifically for the ARM testing, where we've identified, we've run the PTS test suites that match up with the workloads that were identified for the ARM server. So this is a little bit outside of checkbox, and again, we'll go into Jenkins, and may or may not be incorporated into checkbox.
I'll also be adding some other test profiles in the next couple of weeks, like MySQL and some other ones that I'm interested in you guys.
Great. Yeah, because I think the other thing we were trying to identify, I don't know if Craig's here, like testing an entire, like a full workload. So we can identify, we can test Tomcat or Apache independently with the database backend, but there's nothing that necessarily, there's no open source, I think, tools that we've identified. Oh, there are, that'll test all three simultaneously? The stack?
I was thinking like this is something, you can use Apache Bench to call in, like this is calling like PHP running scripts.
Right.
If your PHP script's accessing the underlying bits.
Okay. So I don't know if there's anything else that, for stack testing, stack performance testing that's open source.
That's what I'll be implementing pretty soon that are pretty good for server stack testing that are actually coming from a major vendor.
Okay. And when can you give us an idea of when we can expect those?
November sometime probably. Like I have the scripts all written, I can test them and make sure they're all good and like just push them, so not too much work. So.
Okay. So you said the MySQL was coming, and then what were the other ones?
Let me go some of the
Sure.
What was that test suite you said? The open source test suite that you guys were?
The Phoronix test suite?
What is it?
Phoronix?
Phoronix.
Yeah.
How does it spell?
PHORONIX.
PH?
Thank you.
RONIX.
Those two links that I just posted on the chat are the other tests that I ran.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, are there any other? So we don't actually. I don't think we have the workload list or the. Is it on there?
Which one?
The workload list. The workloads that we've identified that we want to test for ARM.
That's on the other. Go back to the tab.
Oh, here. It's on the
Those two
blueprint.
links of stuff that I tested.
On the other page, I'll put some of the tests that are upcoming.
Please. So, are there any tests that we don't have besides the IPv6? So power.
IPv6 wasn't run, and LTSP wasn't run, and SE Linux wasn't run. Nobody had a real clear definition on how to test SE Linux.
So you guys run spec power?
Yes, power is planned.
Not spec power, though, right?
I'm sorry.
Not spec power though?
No. We're actually doing power load. So we'll run a system under test and have a graphing multimeter hooked up to it to determine what kind of load it's wrong.
Okay.
So
There's a session on that, isn't it?
I don't know.
So Russ, part of the challenge here is trying to stick to readily available open source code as opposed to spec.
Okay.
I mean, servers, everyone's going to want spec A, spec B, spec GDE.
Exactly.
I think that's kind of outside of the scope of what these guys can.
Yeah. Ideally, we do want to keep the test to open source. We're not opposed, I don't believe, to running the test, but I don't think we're. It just doesn't make sense.
I understand.
Yeah. We'll run any test that.
One of the issues there is we want to be able to show our test results so that if one of the vendors sees an anomaly, they can go in and reproduce it and, root cause any issues they may have.
Can you explain why not using the spec benchmark?
Time. You
Why?
can see, if
Why
you
not
look at the
using
two,
spec benchmark?
Time.
Well, it's
we didn't have time, physical personnel time.
Well, the closed source.
spec web.
The closed
Spec
source.
test, the spec benchmarks.
Right. So it's closed source. I don't know if we have another response besides that.
I think it's that combination. So you mentioned, being able to share results. The spec is prohibitive in that respect. You're not allowed to share spec results unless you have them submitted, approved by the spec committee.
Yeah.
So yeah, the official response is if a vendor wanted it, we'd work with you directly to provide it to you, and then it would be your data. But we're not we're not using nor creating spec results for this spec in this work.
So, we have the list, the pages are accessible. If anybody has any other ideas for either the workloads that we have identified or other interesting workloads that we haven't already identified, or stack tests that we haven't done or aren't mentioned, we'd appreciate those. And we can brainstorm the rest of the session, or we can review.
Yes, I think like Hadoop and Memcached and some of that stuff's going to be of interest. I think we'd identified that in the previous blueprint. Maybe for Odorek, there's the simple session times that occurred there. And I think the whiteboard has a list of readily available open source stuff for which our target. So.
Yeah, I think the Hadoop, I think Craig can speak to that.
Yeah, Hadoop has some set of platforms built into it.
Right.
Yeah, there's the Java dependency there and stuff. So.
I know upstream Apache, there's a couple changes going in to make it work buildable on ARM. Someone has been running that at time to get it up and running on my systems.
Okay.
What is the news about Apache? And what's the news about Apache now?
Somebody actually, the Apache Hadoop repo has a couple patches that went into get building on ARM successfully. So using OpenJDK.
You guys running so.
I haven't got it running myself, but the guy who submitted the patches says it's been working through the tests.
I've got it running in our system, so that can help me with it now.
Do you have any plans to standardize all the setups of the benchmarks?
So the Phoronix test suite is pretty standardized for those tests for the for the application.
The setups, when you set up a benchmark, you have your target as a server. Now you want to run some clients,
right?
And send many requests, several requests. Okay. So
right.
What I'm targeting is whether you're going to standardize those clients environment, the test environment.
Right. So
what client server do you use, what CPU is running, what operating system? Because when you start playing with those parameters of test setups, you can modify the results.
No, fair enough. I think for operating system, we're probably going to run Ubuntu. But seriously, for the testing, so Phoronix, for the benchmarks, like Apache Bench, for example, I think that's probably what you're most concerned about. So that has
all benchmarks is the same.
I understand that. So do you want to explain how like Apache Bench works and how Phoronix, the test suite, is set up and can be run on?
Basically, the Phoronix test suite really automates the test installation, and it uses the same version of Apache that's built from source. Just because it's not relying upon, say, the Ubuntu provider Apache web server, because you might have auto-treat catches and other things, and if you're trying to compare different operating systems, you might hit a wall and comparing different Apache versions or different patches that the Ubuntu package is carrying. So it's fully automated building the Apache server from source from the same version, and then the actual test execution for like Apache, I think it's doing 100,000 requests as a default, and all the other Apache server configurations are also all standard. So you're not comparing configuration file differences or anything else like that too.
But it still has some dependency on how this is a strong PC that you're running on.
Right, and the Phoronix test suite does capture all of your system logs, plus all of your CPU information, your motherboard, your disk information, and other.
So I think that's what you're getting to. What are the target platforms? What are the configurations of the target platforms that are going to be tested?
Not only the target, the clients. The whole benchmark setup has to be standard. Which means when I'm testing this with my server, and other company tests their server,
Yeah.
they will have the same hardware infrastructure that tests the server.
Okay, yeah.
We're on the same page.
Got it.
So the benchmarks are all run on the same server. So there is no dependency on clients for the Pharonics
There
test
will be
suite.
the same power of clients that will attack the server.
So there's no dependency, so it's run against itself. So
So you're thinking of something like Spectrum, where you've got a bunch of clients that feed on the server?
Yeah.
So the benchmarks that
the
they
same.
One of the problems-
Apache Bench, the same. You have
One of the
as
problems
many
with
clients
running
as you
that,
can that attack the server.
Okay, so,
one of the
Do you know
problems,
the NAS-PP from the NAS World, NAS-PP benchmark?
which?
NAS-PP.
No.
so one of the problems with running a benchmark like that, where you're depending on separate hardware systems, internet together, you have a lot of variables there. You've got the load on each client can be variable. You've got the network load itself. Network switch capabilities can be different. They can be different even across different models of the same brand of switch. There's just so many variables you add in there, the benchmark itself would become useless. You can get kind of an idea, but
I'm
you
not
really
sure I
can't.
agree with that, but I think the bigger issue right now is that the type of testing these guys are doing would be clobbered by even a single client over the wire on the other side. So you're thinking like a server benchmarking test guy, and we simply don't have the hardware for it yet. I do the type of testing you describe all the time, but it can't really be done at the scale that these guys have hardware for today.
and I think your point, SF, is in those configurations, are you doing something to try and standardize and minimize the number of those variables? So that-
Right, that's why we run with the test, like Pharonics test suite, it's all self-contained.
Right, but once you go beyond that and you have a test suite that has to interact with some other machine to generate traffic or load or whatever, are you standardizing that test harness so that the client machines, if you will, the target machines you're actually testing are all being tested in a as safe as possible way?
Well, I think like they said, we don't have the hardware to
Right.
really scale up
So
to
it's a
anything like
future.
that to be any meaningful. I mean, you know, to do something like that, you're talking about hundreds of client machines attacking a server system. You just don't have that many
It
systems.
doesn't have to be 100 clients.
Well, you're not going to get any useful data off of 5 machines hitting it.
Well, no, so that's around the other way. I think Asaf is mentioning the client as the actual target, i.e. the system under test. The clients being things that are beating on it as a server, but they're actually servers, they're not clients. They're just...
Whatever hardware they are, we just simply don't have the hardware.
Right, but when we do, I think the key message is it should be, you know, trying to be a standard test harness with a reduced number of variables possible, used consistently across any target testing.
Right. Yeah, no, that's agreed. So I've captured that as an item. We haven't hit that yet. If we do, we'll obviously standardize them and publish the results and the specs and the target information so the test can be replicated. What we're trying to do is avoid those situations because there's multiple layers of dependencies and variables. It's just, it adds a lot of complexity. Especially in the initial stages, there's not going to be a lot of hardware to go around, so it's going to be very difficult to reproduce those kind of tests. So what we're focusing on is something, again, like Pharonics Test Suite, which it's all isolated to one system, and it can be easily replicated across other systems and other hardware, so you can do comparisons that make sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I think, like you say, given the hardware we have, but we definitely need to get past that because these are servers and
Right.
ultimately they serve data.
Right.
We need to test that.
But it's also not a goal, I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, to have other companies run these same benchmarks as if we're publishing the work of the benchmark for others to run. That's not our particular goal. So, just so you know it. I mean, we intend to run these, and your point is well taken that you've captured the item that we need to make sure they run in a standard way across machines, absolutely. But we don't intend to give them to other companies and say, make sure you can run them the same way.
Yeah, but once you're running open source,
Agreed. Someone else may want to do it. I agree with that.
probably want to use it.
Agreed.
Be a good
Agreed. But
idea.
we're not prepared today to try to help them set up to do that. We're not, that's not an objective.
The best we can do is say, here's your client software system installation, here's your server installation, run the tests. Beyond that, we really can't do much more because, you know, they may not have the exact same hardware.
Yeah, but this is the issue, because if you're handing out some kind of benchmark,
we're not handing out
We aren't handing it out, so that's
yeah,
my
but
point.
it would be open source eventually, and you can download it and try it out. Right?
So these guys aren't creating any new benchmarks.
Right.
There's no such thing as a canonical benchmark, right? So for Onyx happens to be open source, but it's an independent benchmark suite. Apache Bench, you know, that's open source. So they're using those tools to collect the data, and not planning to publish actual performance results, just pass-fail, but use that data internally to help benchmark an ARM system versus maybe an x86 system, or an ARM based on Lyric versus an ARM on Precious or Precise, or you know, to see improvements as we fix things and enhance things. So.
Okay, but again, I see that not only Ubuntu guys will use those tests.
No, correct.
Anybody
do whatever they want.
Yeah, anybody you can run those right now on your laptop if you wanted to, and you can compare the results to the
Once
bandit.
we have multi-hardware environment setups for benchmarking, it will be best that each and every one have the same.
But see, we're not using them for benchmarking. If anything, we're using them just to troubleshoot issues with hardware. We don't care about benchmark results other than, is it getting faster with newer kernels or newer software updates, or are we regressing?
We're not
But
benchmarking.
we're not publishing any benchmarks.
Right, we're not benchmarking, we're using benchmarks.
So the idea is to make sure that Ubuntu runs efficiently and effectively on the target platform. It's a new platform. We want to make sure that it runs the way it should, right, on any server. And those benchmarks are going to help us fine-tune not only the workloads and the applications, but the underlying dependencies, right?
And find any glaring software performance.
Right.
Right.
The
And
kernel.
exactly, and we're going to document those test cases as we have and explain, so not only the vendors, but the community can assist in fixing those problems. So we're going to make it as easy as possible for people to replicate the exact same test cases to find the exact same problems. So we can have those things addressed and fixed in the shortest time frame possible for the LTS release. So that's the goal. Is that pretty clear? All right. And I mean, if there's anything else that you'd like to see, I mean, you can feel free to suggest those, like the multiple client setups. It's just, again, with limited hardware, it's going to be difficult to replicate those scenarios, you know. So.
There's one comment there on the Membase.
Yeah, I added, so Membase, it's, I don't know if it's an interesting, we can look at it and see.
I think it's interesting. There was some issue with it before. Rob, do you recall that was the one that had the 64-bit sync primitive GCC dependency, or Jason, was it you? Do you remember that?
I don't think it's Membase.
It was Membase, right? So Lenaro, I think, worked on the GCC toolchain to add some 64-bit sync primitives to the ARM GCC implementation. Membase was the specific code that needed that. So.
Okay.
But anyway, it's of interest.
So what does that do? Just memory benchmarking?
No. Rob, do you know?
needed 64-bit atomic operations.
Well, no, I mean, what is the actual
What is
benchmark
Membase?
doing?
Membase is an app, right? I think it's a distributed source.
NoSQL database.
Okay.
Yeah. You may want to cross-reference the previous blueprint from where we went through a bunch of this before and had a list of benchmarks that were of interest.
Sorry?
And so we may want to just cross-reference the previous blueprint, because we actually went through and created a list of...
Yeah, the previous blueprint's actually going to be carried forward into
okay.
So it just hasn't been written up.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other interesting either workloads or test cases or any other concerns?
So that, so Russ, not to put you on the spot, but like a stress type test from system guys, just not necessarily looking at performance, but kind of stress this system and leave it running for a while, see what goes over.
We have our own custom stuff that we run. Some of the things that I run on a regular basis, mem tester on ARM.
Which is it?
Mem tester. Let's see. What else?
He's a mem tester, right?
Yeah.
Make it a simple.
I run spec power a lot because of it gives me the SSJ operations that I can compare with other systems. Maybe necessarily not even for the power numbers, but just for the workload numbers. Of course, you guys, that's a proprietary test, though. It's
Yeah.
an open source test. I'm trying to think. I don't run a whole lot of open source tests. Yeah, sorry.
And I mean, I don't know if there's an open source equivalent or a set of,
Not that I'm aware of.
yeah, that we can,
Let me go back through. I'll try to take some notes and there's a way I can add these to.
yeah, you can add it to the whiteboard for the blueprint at any point.
Okay, I'll do that.
That'd be great.
What about systat? Like understand, keystat, VMstat, that kind of stuff for testing.
The stats for testing or for just
I
getting
think there's some
information?
testing. Alex, you know about the systat stuff though?
Yeah.
Do you guys
Yeah,
use that for testing or?
Sure.
So IOstat, VMstat?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's most value when you're trying to find bottlenecks.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
I know one that we do a lot for stress testing. We do a kernel loop. We just continually, we wrote a simple script to build the kernel, and we'll run it multiple times continuously.
Yeah, there's,
Yeah, there's a build Linux kernel test profile in there, and by default builds it 3 times.
Yeah.
yeah, that one, I think that
On
one.
ARM, it's a little more fun.
It is.
You do that for stability testing or?
I just stress test.
Some reason it works pretty well.
NetPerf. I'm trying to think of other tests we run.
So one of the things you guys have to realize is the hardware we currently have isn't really optimized for heavy disk I/O stuff. So we only have one test platform that has true native SATA on it, but it's only a single core system. Our dual core Panda boards, the only hard drive capabilities is off the USB bus, which we did using some of the benchmarking testing. We did find a bug in the USB stack. It was negligible on x86, but horrendous on the ARM stuff. And I think we saw, what, a 5x or 10x performance increase once we fixed
About
that.
10x.
Yeah. So on x86, it was like 2x maybe. So
Actually, turned out to be a chip Dorada. Turned out to be an L2 Dorada.
Oh, for the USB launch.
So what are the goals for P?
Goals for P,
lots of testing.
so goals for P are to explore anything that differs from linear, to automate the testing, to close the other gaps like IPv6 and I guess that's the only other one that hasn't really been tested. Hadoop, stuff that we didn't get a chance to. And then obviously when the real hardware comes in to actually run those tests and then start getting those, doing the tuning of performance.
Can we capture that? Do I just write it? So,
Sure, please.
You mentioned Hadoop.
Yeah, Hadoop's a workload that's been identified. We just, again, the ARM piece of it isn't fully, well, it's working.
Yeah, it works.
Panda boards. And yeah, and actually the Panda equipment hasn't been delivered yet to the platform, so
Is that okay?
Do you guys run Unix bench?
I don't know.
Which?
Unix bench?
I don't think we ran that, but I think it was on a list. I think I saw it on a list on a different.
So we can have that.
You first time.
I'm sorry? And I think we've also prioritized the workloads to see, and the applications in the test to see which ones are more interesting than others. So if there's a concern of which ones are more interesting than others, at least on the pandas, time is kind of, test time's a little bit harder to get on those, and the tests obviously run longer, so the applications and the benchmarks that apply that are more interesting will get run first and more often.
Has there been much intensive AHCI testing on ARM at all, to your guys' knowledge? Are you familiar with AHCI?
AHCI?
AHCI is the interface to SATA.
Well, we don't have any systems with SATA.
Yeah. Well, that's not, so you may not have any, but there is at least one system that has true SATA that, as far as I know, is not hanging off a USB port.
Right, that's the Quick Start board. We just got support for the Quick Start board this last cycle, so we haven't actually had time to do any testing.
Yeah, because I mean, at some point you're going to want to do intensive disk testing,
right.
And if you can expose ARM-specific inferiority before you get real hardware,
right.
Then you'll have a leg up.
We've done a little bit of smart testing on it, on that particular system, but again, it was really limited because we were in the middle of bringing the system up. And
yeah,
a lot of other major issues to resolve there, like getting file systems running.
There's currently a session on storage testing.
But yeah, the smart testing was actually in the OARM image validation, I think.
Yeah, the non-IO bound testing or benchmarks right now can be more useful, I guess, to identify problems where the IO bound stuff, or at least on the pandas that we've had, a little bit more difficult to, I mean, it's not that we haven't identified problems, but it's a little bit more difficult to identify.
Understood.
Yeah.
Can you tell what's the difference between the x86 server benchmarking and the ARM server benchmarking?
Not yet, because they don't have hardware.
You mean numbers?
No, not numbers. The packages on the
all of our packages are recompiled for whatever hardware we're supporting to run. So unless the package doesn't compile, we're running the exact same software stack on both. So whenever an update is pushed into the pool, it's recompiled on all architectures we support.
Anything else?
Also worth noting, I don't know if you played around with the but the product test suite does have a monitoring module where for each test it can log like the power consumption, assuming you have your in some way, CPU usage, IO weight, and other information. It's in the documentation, but then like basically when you have that module loaded for every test result, besides saying the Apache build time or whatever you're testing, it'll also show you that information for each individual test result. So if you want to compare the IO weight between different kernel versions for each test or anything like that.
And is that part of the, it's additional to the
It's already bundled with the product set, so you just have to set an environmental variable for what sensors you want logged. In the other pad, I'll post a link to the documentation about it.
But is that hardware specific?
For like the power consumption, it's checking for specific like sysfs nodes and everything like that. For the CPU temperature, it's pretty, I'm not sure ran it on ARM. Like I know for some like the HP touchpad, most of those sensors work fine on the product accessory current version. But if anything doesn't show up, I can easily add those sensors, assuming the sensors are there.
Yeah. Okay.
Might be worth looking at just running for a pipe cleaning to see what we got available. So, or what we need to expose.
Is it Duke in Maine?
No.
No, it's not. Purdue, it's not the main.
Oh, yeah, it won't be me.
It's not even Debian.
Right. There's
Debian's
some,
old, because they have one maintainer and it's called maintainer. Yeah,
yeah, it was. But I don't remember, I think it was going to be investigated whether, because there's 3 different versions, 2 versions are being used, and then the upstream version which nobody uses, but we want to figure that out.
I guess we're contemplating putting a patch of new in our town. But the other one
Does
more numbers, that one will go to our town. So that they can manage their platform themselves. Put it up into the wall, whereas the patch will be for us to manage.
Anything else?
So there's other databases you could add to the list, like Cassandra. I don't know.
Is Cassandra on or? I don't really tend to do people.
Yeah, I don't know officially what's out there, but run it online.
So I think what we'll do is post, because I thought it was on that page, it must have gotten removed or deleted, but we'll post the workloads that we're planning to test Cassandra. Cassandra was identified previously.
All right.
I don't think we've gotten to it yet, but
All right.
some of the more elaborate. The only thing I think with Cassandra, is there an automated, or is there a built-in test like Hadoop for it, or is it?
I'm not sure.
Okay. So that's the other thing. So we can install it and we can.
Where are you going to run against it?
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So for the workloads that we will identify, I will obviously specify a test or test cases that we've identified to run against it. If not, we'll just post that we're looking for those, and again, anybody can edit that and suggest test cases for those workload or volunteer test data, and we can test them.
Cool.
And so again, this is an open. Feel free to run these tests on your own hardware and help out as we go along through the LTS cycle. And I don't know if we have, do we have a mailing list that's besides the,
Not that I really know.
for testing? Well, there's the meeting, so there's the ARM the community meeting Thursdays, right, at 11
Yes,
o'clock Eastern?
That's, anyone, I think it's 1900 UTC now.
Okay.
I'll send out a reminder email next week, but feel free to attend. If you regularly attend the meeting, I ask that you add, the stuff you've done to the neutral wiki page. There are notes on that, but it's not mandatory for people who don't want to talk.
Right. So that's hash Ubuntu dash meeting in IRC on Freenode. And again, what's the UTC time, 1900?
I think it's 19 or 21. I send an email out to Ubuntu demo every week with the time.
So if you troll on Ubuntu-meeting for a couple hours, you'll run a meeting on Thursdays. And we'll be discussing our progress, and it's an open discussion, so if there's any concerns midway or questions or results that you want to help or testing, please feel free to join.
You're talking about the Ubuntu marketing, right, Mike?
Yeah.
That's 1,500 UTC.
Oh, 1,500. Well, so much for that pantry.
You don't get to sleep in that much.
We're just about out of time, so is there anything else to bring up quickly?
I think that's it. Great. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.